I always went into the woods as a child. It was around evening, about 7 o'clock, and it was cold outside, normal for late fall. I was just standing on my porch, looking at the woods. My family had moved here a few years back. The house was brick, had 2 floors and 5 bedrooms. My bedroom was upstairs, and my parents lived downstairs. This area is not that far from civilization. It was only a few blocks away from a city. I actually loved the nature around these woods. I found it very calm and relaxing. I always liked these woods for their serene wilderness and vast amount of trees. The trees spanned at least 1 mile. I looked around and saw an abandoned lumberjack camp. No one was there, only machines. The machines stood in around one single object, a chainsaw. The camp felt so desolate and old. The wood seemed to have rotted over time, and the machines had rusted a bit. It's probably been years since this place was last used. I kept my distance, however, and hugged a nearby tree. I surely didn't know what to expect. If I took one more step, I surely would have fallen down the hill and broken one of my legs. I looked around at the entire camp. 3 cabins, machines around a chainsaw, a tractor, and wooden logs with axes on them, all behind the cabins for shipment. It was starting to get dark, so I went back to my house, which was nearby. I decided to search it the next day, probably to see what happened. I told my mother what was down there, and she said to me, "Honey, whatever you do, don't touch anything down there, and don't go down there without supervision. Your father will show you around tomorrow." After dinner, I went up to my bedroom and put on my pajamas and went to sleep. The next day, my dad and I went down to the camp area in the woods. We found our way down and took a look around, but still, no one was there. My dad and I looked around the cabins, looked at the old and rotting wood, the rusted axes, and the tractor. The last thing that we saw was the circle of machinery around the chainsaw. My dad remarked, Whoever these guys were, they surely left this place in a hurry." And that's when it caught my eye. A broken piece of machinery, a wood chipper to be exact, that was more rusted than the others. In fact, I'd say it had been basically torn apart and disassembled in a quick fashion. It stood out resiliently and seemed to tell a story that the other machines just couldn't. Right next to it was a buzzsaw that didn't have its blade. Eventually, my dad and I went up the hill, and he told me, "Stay near the house and be safe. I don't want you to go down there without an adult, okay?" As my father went back to our house, I decided to go back to a stump of a cut tree and sit down. I closed my eyes, breathing the fresh air, listening to the trees waving and the birds chirping. The birds sang such a lovely song, and the trees sounded like a symphony to fit with the chorus of birds. Suddenly, the chirping ceased, and I opened my eyes quickly. I must have fallen asleep, as it was getting dark outside. Very dark. The moon was rising, and the stars were about to come out, so I decided to go back home. I went to my left, where my house was. The lights were off. Weird, I thought to myself. Mummy and Daddy usually leave the lights on. I ran quickly to my house, but the door was open. I grabbed the emergency flashlight, turned it on, and walked into the house. The older wooden floorboards were creaking, so I had to go to the newer wooden floors. I looked around the house, not seeing my parents. I then heard a clang come from the kitchen. I ran in the opposite direction in fright, knowing that someone might be in our house. I started hearing revving. 1, 2, 3. On the 4th, I knew what was revving up. It was a chainsaw. I hid in my closet, hoping that whoever was in my house wouldn't find me. The sound of the chainsaw started to get closer, as I heard the stair boards creak and the sound of footsteps come closer. I looked at the door. That's the first thing that was open. A silhouette was coming into the room. It was a tall, well-built man, holding a chainsaw. His hair seemed to go around at random, so he must have had bandages or something on his head. Finally, I saw his eyes. His bloodshot eyes. They glowed in the dark room and seemed to stare at me. He just walked calmly in my room, looking around, the floor creaking all the while. He seemed to be holding something in his left hand. It was my mother. I started to freak out, but for some reason, I couldn't scream. I was tearing up at the sight of it. I backed into the closet, but it must have caught his attention. Soon, the man found me and laughed as he was about to swing his chainsaw down at me. I woke up in a flash, screaming. I was still on the stump, so I must have fallen asleep into a nightmare. It was evening now, and I ran to my house. I ran inside, slammed the door, and ran upstairs. My mother asked, "What's wrong, honey?" I didn't reply. Day to day, I stayed in my house and never went into the woods. I knew that someone or something was out there, just waiting for me to slip up once in the woods. I avoided it whenever I could, and most of the time, I'd rather be in the city, with civilization, with police. Over time, however, I started to forget what my nightmare was, and what exactly was so scary about the woods. Eventually, I coped with the realization that no one was in those woods. Around 2 years later, when I was now 13, my dad asked, "Want to go to the lumber camp again?" "Yes, I'd like to see it," I said. We grabbed our jackets and went into the woods once more. It was a very cold December afternoon, so we decided to make the trip quick. It was about 10 minutes until we finally got to the camp. It seemed to get warmer every step we took. It was in ruins now. The cabins were crushed by the trees, and the machinery was toppled over. All of the machines and buildings had corroded over time, and they looked terrible. However, there was one thing missing, and it was the chainsaw. I told my dad that we had to go, and he agreed, telling me, "Oh, you must not like this place then." Hours after we got home, I closed my eyes, opened the window, and listened to the trees again. When I opened them though, it was completely dark. I could barely see a thing. This time, I made sure I wasn't dreaming, so I hit myself. Nothing. Now, I knew I wasn't in a dream, so I made sure to grab the flashlight on my dresser and turned it on. I asked for my parents. "Mum? Dad? Are you here?" No response. I looked around my house. Nothing was in disarray, so I slowly went down to look for the lights. I switched on the lights. After a short while, I found them, but they wouldn't switch on. Now, the only source of light is my flashlight. So slowly, I walked down the stairs to make sure no one was inside. The door was shut and, in fact, locked. No one could have gotten inside by now. It was impossible. I went to my parents' room, but they weren't there at all. I asked again, "Mum? Dad? Please answer me." Soon, I heard my mum's voice. "David." It was outside, in the woods. The voice repeated, "David, please, honey, come back to me." My head told me not to go, but my body led itself out of the door. I made sure to grab the hatchet, should anything try to get me. My eyes saw as the woods, covered in a thin fog, came ever so close to me, or as I came closer to the woods. I kept going towards the voice of my mother, hoping that I'd see her. I looked around the woods until I bumped into something. My flashlight had gone out at that time, so this came as some surprise. Whatever I bumped into was cold to the touch. I smashed the flashlight on the palm of my hand, and it flickered back on for a moment. Directly in front of me was my mother. She was standing in front of me like a statue, completely void of a soul. Her eyes were nothing but white, and blood had frozen as it trickled down her legs. Her head was pointing towards the right, so reluctantly, I went right. As I looked around the woods, I finally found my father, with the same eyes and stance. His body was pointing to the camp. I decided to face whatever is there, head on, and went slowly down to the camp. I looked around the deserted camp. The desolate area was warmer than usual, but still void of life. The trees seemed to surround me at this point, and the sky seemed to turn red, which was unusual for a new moon. I turned around and ran back to my house, as a maniacal laughter broke the silence. Fear spread through my entire body at this point, so I sprinted. As I stopped to catch my breath, I heard a voice behind me. "David," it said, in a cold, raspy voice. A sudden burst of fear came into me as I started to run once more. As I was running, I heard trees snapping down and falling, but I dared not to look back. I was terrified about what had happened to my mother and father, and I didn't want the same to happen to me. I was tearing up as I ran back in, shutting the door, locking it, closing the shutters on the windows, and then locking them. I walked back slowly, as I hoped that nothing would get me. It was silent, no noise, nothing. But then, I heard a rev again, the same one from my dream those years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4. Soon, I heard a bump against the door, and then it was smashed completely. I ran up the stairs and into my closet. I heard a chainsaw completely saw through something, most likely the door. My fear was heightened. I was completely defenseless against the chainsaw, even with a hatchet, so I turned off my flashlight. The person was walking up the stairs. I heard my mum's voice and my dad's, all saying the same word. David. I heard the voices of many people I've met in my life. But how could someone imitate all of those voices? It's almost impossible. I was shaking as the man slowly opened my door. The chainsaw pointed in first, then the arms, and then the rest of the body. The man didn't look like the one from my dreams. No, he was worse. His chest had a large gash, and his arms had 3 cuts on either side, mirroring each other. His pants were ragged, blue with what appeared like blood spatters. His bloodshot eyes, however, were the same soul-piercing eyes that I saw 2 years ago in my nightmare. I did my best not to scream as he came near the closet, his bloodshot eyes looking into it with such content. However, he then left my room as if he didn't see me. He dropped something out of his pocket, but left as if he didn't mind. After 15 minutes, all went silent as I started to cry once again. And after 30 more minutes, the lights came back on. I cautiously looked around to see if the man was still at my house. I couldn't see him anywhere. I breathed a sigh of relief. The man was gone. Suddenly, I remembered what he'd dropped and picked it up. It was a picture of many people from the same camp. And there was also a name, Jonathan MacLeod, and an arrow pointing to the third person from the right. He held a chainsaw, the same one that the bloodshot man held. I called the police, who investigated the whereabouts of my parents and the man. They came back with only my mother, who was an empty shell of her former self. She simply stared directly forwards, not answering any questions. My father, however, was nowhere to be found, and neither was the man. Later that night, as I couldn't sleep, I searched online for Jonathan MacLeod. What came up was a news article stating that there was an accident that critically injured someone. It was reported that a malfunction with one of the machines, specifically a saw, caused horrific injuries to that poor man. A freak explosion caused one of the blades to cut into his face, slitting his mouth wide open. Miraculously, he survived that initial injury though. His hands caught the blade before it could cut through his head. He was then rushed to the hospital and was treated in the emergency room. Within a couple of hours, his vital signs ceased and he was deemed deceased. It stayed like that for 2 hours. Life, death, life, death. It was after the 16th time he finally succumbed to his injuries and passed away. My mind raced as I wondered how I managed to see him. Surely it wasn't a dream. After all, my father hadn't been found. I cared for my mother from that day onwards, who always seemed to look far off into the distance. She was never the same. About 10 years later, I'd moved into my new house with my wife and young daughter, along with my mother, whose health was now failing. I wanted to move far, far away from any kind of woods or trees. And so, we lived in a city centre. Sometimes, however, I still hear the sound of a chainsaw in the distance, even though we live nowhere near any kind of mill. I still see the man in my dreams, with the last thing I see before I wake up being his terrifying bloodshot eyes. My daughter runs into my room at times, telling me that there's a scary man in her dreams. But today, I had a different dream. The man was engulfed in a white fog and slowly came closer to me. He seemed distorted, as if I was watching him through an old TV set. He was saying one thing to me in his horrifying, raspy voice. "Do not be afraid." I woke up with a start at 6 a.m, with my daughter and wife sleeping soundly by my side. My daughter must have gotten up in the night to sleep with us, as she often did. As I went to close my eyes again, however, I spotted something standing by my open door. A weathered and rusty woodman's axe.